But today's installment focuses on Virginia's unstable housing market. So I want to take an opportunity to just share some information with you all. The nation's housing crisis has reached emergency levels. Many families spend more than half of their earnings on rent. They're struggling to hold down jobs, or they pay too little in order to ensure that they have stabilized housing. Rising homelessness, evictions, and housing instability are the result of a system that advances the interests of Wall Street and corporations over sometimes the health and well-being of our families and communities. There has been a long history of housing security for people of color in the United States due to racially targeted policies. These policies and practices continue to keep communities of color in poverty. In 2019, before the health pandemic affected our livelihoods, an estimated 34 million individuals were living in poverty in the United States, with African Americans and the Latino population experiencing more higher rates of poverty than whites. Native American, Black, and Hispanic renters were also more likely to have extremely low incomes. During the coronavirus pandemic, disparities by race have persisted. Renters of color have reported less confidence in their ability to be able to pay rent. They're experiencing difficulty staying current on rent. The coronavirus pandemic is also affecting renters of color differently, exacerbating past inequality and leading the path to a future of worsening racial disparity. 11 million renters pay almost 25% of more than their rents, their cost burden. 20% of renters don't even have $400 available in liquid assets. The rental housing supply shortage of 7 million homes are impacting extremely low income renters. Only 1 in 5 renters are qualified for federal housing assistance. According to the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, the State of the Nation's Housing 2020, the share cost of individuals that are burdened by housing is affected by race and ethnicity and are led by the African American and Hispanic communities. That means over 900,000 individuals are evicted each and every year. African American women and single parent head of households are leading and are at risk for evictions. Tenants who don't understand Virginia's eviction laws, most tenants don't have even legal representation in evictions. Something that has been central to here in the Richmond area, back in spring of 2018, Princeton sociologist Matthew Desmond released a dramatic new data set that showcased on the cover of the New York Times, showing that Richmond, Virginia ranked in the top 10 cities in the country and showed as an outliner for nationally eviction rates, facing a rate over 11%. Eviction is more than about removing a tenant from a housing unit. It drags down our communities on many levels. Not only does it impact families and communities, but it also impacts schools, ultimately localities and jurisdictions. Housing instability impacts schools, outcomes, jobs, and the mental health of families. Evictions continue to have a profound effect on the academic achievements for children in schools and have been known to have some of the long-term effects of a child's development. Eviction is not a social issue or a job issue, it's a poverty issue, and it poses immediate risk of homelessness as well as loss of personal property, possessions, and pride. Renters of color continue to be more cost burdened, and those are the individuals that have been not only facing discrimination in housing, but have been disproportionately impacted. So today we're going to have a wonderful conversation with Dr. Kathryn Howell, who is the co-director of the RVA Eviction Lab and associate professor at the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. She also is a member of Home's Board of Directors. I'm excited about this conversation today. There's so many areas that we could go in with this direction, but we're going to talk a little bit about the rental market today, evictions pre and post-COVID, and addressing historical current racial inequalities in housing and the impact that it continues to have on housing insecurities. So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker today. In addition to her serving as the co-founder of the RVA Eviction Lab, she has been an associate professor of urban and regional planning at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research unpacks concepts of policy and planning that can be used to address all of these issues. Dr. Howell's research has integrated the policies and governance structures and roles of tenants and advocacy in the preservation of affordable housing and the ways in which public spaces implementation and maintenance can facilitate or bridge the right to the city for communities of colors. She continues to work with affordable housing advocates, organizers, policymakers in Washington, D.C. on affordable housing preservation policy creation and advocacy. It has just been a breath of fresh air to have her be a part of the RVA Eviction Lab, where she is exploring housing instability and mobilization and organization through collaborative partnerships, community organizations here in the capital city of Richmond. Again, we're so happy to have her with us today. And again, as I shared earlier, she has been a great addition to our board of directors, where she also serves as vice chairperson leading our policy and advisory committee. Will you please welcome Dr. Kate Howe? Hello, I call you Dr. Kate, so didn't want individuals to think I'm being disrespectful.
Oh, not at all.
But thank you so much for being here with us today and just talking about a topic, as I stated earlier, that we could just spend so much time unpacking. But I would really like for you to kind of tell us with a research lens a little bit about what research reveals based upon the current unstable rental housing market, and enlighten us what impact do you think that's going to have on our continued communities?
This is sort of a big question. I read it and I was like, whoa, I could go anywhere with this. And she's given, you know, a professor carte blanche to talk about anything, which is never a good idea, to be absolutely clear. But I think, you know, one of the things that I think a lot about, right, with the conversations that have already been had here, and certainly with the work that Home does on the home ownership side, you know, we talk a lot about exclusion, right? We talk a lot about inability to access home ownership, inability to access really credit, but that ultimately has an impact, and it is impacted by the issues in the rental market. And by the way, for those of you who aren't here, it's pouring rain outside, and I thought my microphone was messing up, and then I realized it's actually just wind and rain coming in the window. So apologies for that. That's why I keep looking at the window. And I'm like, what's going on? So this exclusion actually matters, right? So, you know, we have a situation historically where people of color, particularly African Americans, were excluded from home ownership. Well, so what does that mean, right? What does that, where does that put you in the housing market? Well, it puts you in the rental housing market. Okay, well, that sounds not great. But then we started creating laws and reinforcing laws that make rental housing actually more unstable. Whether that is in, you know, you don't know if your lease is going to get renewed. You can pay your rent, be on time, do everything right, and your landlord at the end of the year could say, sorry, we're not renewing your lease. So you have no predictability, right? And it's expensive to move. It's expensive to be evicted. Those of us who are renters know that every time you move, you got to get the moving truck, and you got to pay the deposit, and you got to do all these kind of things, and buy a new trash can and buy a new mop, right? These kind of things, right? We all have to go to Target. But that's even more, it's sort of exacerbated when you have to deal with, okay, so where do my kids now go to school? Can I afford the rental unit that I want, right? This is time off of work. This is exhausting time. And then, you know, sort of this has implications for political power. because every time you move, you got to change your voter registration. You got to figure out who your elected officials are. What's your community association? And good Lord, do you even have time to be that kind of citizen when you're trying to keep house and home together? So this has sort of this exclusion, all these fair housing issues that we talk about a lot on the homeownership side have real implications on the rental side. So we've made actually rental housing even more unstable, and that gets reinforced over and over again as we think about what exclusion in terms of screening criteria, right? Makes it harder to get into housing. So that's kind of a long-winded response to your short question. But I think that this is an important thing to understand, that this issue of unstable rental housing is, as Monica mentioned in the introduction, very much racialized. And it has a disproportionate effect on Black women, people of color in general, but Black women are most likely to be evicted, right? This is something that we know from research over and over and over again. We know that in Virginia, my colleague, Ben Teresa, with whom I co-direct the RVA Eviction Lab, has done research that looks at what are the kind of main drivers that are predicting eviction, right? So he looked at the neighborhood level, and we did all things like rent burden and median income, median home price. And the thing that was the biggest predictor by double any other predictor of neighborhood racial composition, neighborhood eviction rate, was neighborhood racial composition. And so that meant that as non-white population increased, so did eviction rate. But importantly, as white population increased, so did eviction rate. So in fact, there's a protective effect of white neighborhoods, right? And so this is really important when we think about that. We think about this unstable housing environment, we have to take it from a racial lens. We cannot sort of say, we're gonna do race neutral policy and we'll be good, because these things were created through racialized landscapes. And that was repeated, right? We saw this, whether it's through, when you look at the maps, of the redlining maps, you can overlay that with the urban renewal maps, which then you overlay with the foreclosure maps, and you again overlay with eviction maps, and they are the same neighborhoods being evicted over and over and over again. And so if we think about, go back to the individual things I talked about cost, about community engagement, community power, well, what does that mean for the larger collective community, right? So these have huge implications for just how we even think about neighborhoods. And how we think about, if we say, well, as some electeds in Richmond have in the past, well, I don't want to hear from more renters. Well, that kind of takes out a whole large group of people in this city, right? And so it means that we're only listening to a particular group, which is a particular group. And that's really important. So I'll stop there and then we can talk more.
Great introduction. You talked about communities and having the conversation. And again, we've been talking about affordable housing for decades. This is not a new conversation. At one point, individuals, as you talk about, people don't want to talk to renters. Some people don't want renters in their communities. Mm-hmm. They have that NIMBYism attitude, not in my backyard. So what is needed, Dr. Kate, to ensure a system-wide collaboration of local and state governments, nonprofits, stakeholders, and societies as a whole to stop this spiraling effect of housing instability and affordability?
I love this question because it's more than just tell me the policy, right? Everybody wants to know the policy. What do we just do? We are not short of ideas. Like policy people, I co-edited a special edition of a journal last year on eviction, right? And usually when you do a guest editing, it's one edition. We had so many articles about eviction policy that we did 3 journal editions in one special issue, right? So we're not out of ideas, but what we're out of is this coalition piece. And what we have to think about this as coalition building and power building. And it has to center those who are most impacted. We can't build coalitions of people all sort of up here who maybe don't live in the city, right? Or don't live in the state, or aren't impacted, right? Elected officials want to hear from the people who are feeling what's going on. And we also need to understand, like I can give you all data all day long. We've got more data at the Eviction Lab than we know what to do with. So much information. I can tell you about patterns. I can tell you about where it's happening. I can point at a thing and say, that's a thing. What I can't tell you is what it's like for those tenants who never actually even make it to court because they're so frustrated or feel so like disempowered that they can't get there, or because they have so much going on. I can't tell you about those unofficial things that happen when a landlord just says you're out. And a mom's like, well, shoot, I've got 3 days to find a house. I can't tell you about that, but that's a real situation. And so we have to really kind of rethink how we think about what is expertise and who has a voice in this conversation. And I do think that that's just a real key part of this, is that we have to build our coalitions from the bottom up. And that's hard, right? Because we all sort of get in this space where we're like, well, but what's the policy? What's the thing? We can go up to General Assembly. We know how this works. We've got our existing networks and we talk to the same people, right? Because we have trusted people. But we have to think beyond that if we're going to be really creative about this. It requires not just creative policy solutions, which are 100% a big deal, but it takes creative coalition building. And that doesn't mean we always all get along. Doesn't mean we always all have the same ends, but it means that we can meet on certain things and all come together. And I think this affordable housing provision situation is a big piece of that, right? And rent assistance.
Right.
So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Kate. So, you talked about policy, we're always looking for the data, analyzing that, trying to figure out what that means. And then, Home's been involved with advocating for policy solutions for years. And, over the last couple of years, we've really been focusing on policies that prevent eviction, housing instability. And again, we have been involved in this eviction diversion and prevention space over the last 3 years. Working with the city of Richmond. We've been involved with the Department of Housing and Community Development on their statewide education and outreach initiative. And so again, it's all about, like you said, the families, and the impact. What should be Home's role and what is our responsibility going forward? We have this debate going back and forth. We're a fair housing organization enforcing the Fair Housing Act, but a part of preventing evictions is fair housing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because I always think about there's a few different spaces for rental housing and keeping people. So you have to, there's the things about getting people into quality, affordable housing. And so that's things like, okay, what are the screening criteria? And Home's really been on the forefront talking about some of these things over the past few years, certainly around the things that are involved now in the Fair Housing Act. I think the LGBTQ protections was such a huge win and such a long-term fight at the General Assembly. Anybody who knows about that knows that Home was at it, which was amazing. And so there's those kinds of things, but it's also things like, how do we think about credit checks? How do we think about source of income protection, which was another big win, but how do we enforce source of income? How do we think about criminal background checks and the ways that those can keep people out of housing? So that's kind of the front end piece. But then once people are in housing, you want it to be quality, affordable housing, because that's also a fair housing issue. If you get into housing and there's holes in the ceiling, you don't have reliable water, reliable heat, is that really fair housing? Like, you're literally in a unit, but it's really unclear that's something, it's not where I would want to raise a family. And so I think that we have to think about what fair housing really means and what is fair. And we know what it technically means from any lawyers are like, well, we know what fair housing is, Kate. But I'm a professor, so I'm going to reinterpret. Not a lawyer. But the final thing is then thinking about, okay, well, so once people are in there, how do we keep them in a stable tenure? Because that ultimately also is a fairness issue. And it means that people can then build wealth, people can build stability for their families. We know that stable housing matters for jobs, mental health, physical health, childhood outcomes. I mean, there's the whole list is there. And so I think that we can be involved at various points. I mean, there's really clear ones on the front end, right? Home does that. That's bread and butter. But the longer term pieces of how do we advocate for affordable housing? How do we advocate for stable, affordable housing? Those are equally important.
Absolutely. So, you talked about the advocacy of adding the new protected classes to the Fair Housing Act, source of income, which has been a huge issue, sexual orientation, gender identity, veteran status. And so we've got these policies in place. So what do you think are some of the long-term strategies that we really need to focus on that will support housing stabilization?
Well, I think one thing that we figured out during pandemic is that rent assistance works. Turns out when people can pay the rent, they can stay in place. And so we know, and we've done research on this to find that it costs a heck of a lot less from a public perspective to help pay someone's rent than it does to address all of the other needs that happen as a sort of knock-on effect of eviction. So we know that. So that's one sort of long-term piece, is we've got to think about long-term rental assistance. And it can't be emergency, right? If we're doing this in the courthouse, it's kind of like, and I've used this analogy a lot, but it's kind of like bending the water hose to shut the water off, right? You're not actually shutting the water off. You are literally just stopping the water from coming out the end. But you still have families that are then sort of in this stress cycle and in this kind of constant instability space. So I do think we can think about long-term rental assistance, whether that is shallow vouchers, whether that is place-based rental assistance in new affordable housing that gets to deeply affordable spaces. Sort of, I think it was kind of exciting towards the end of the last administration when they really started talking about funding the state's Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
Yes.
That was really exciting. I was like,
Huge,
we
yes.
are moving, we're doing
Yeah.
this. But there's also been a lot of talk within advocacy communities of sort of working through a statewide voucher program that will actually help to expand rental assistance to families. And then I do think we have to work on that legal side of making a rental tenure more sustainable for families, because you can say home ownership all you want, but our job situation, our employment situation is not set up for that for a lot of families. And so families still need somewhere stable to be.
Exactly. Yeah. We need to focus on every element of the housing ecosystem.
Absolutely.
So again, well, that's all the initial questions that I have. I hope we have some questions from our participants here in the room or those that are joining us online. So let me check with my staff. They're emailing me or texting me rather questions. Okay, this is a great question, Dr. Kate.
Oh boy.
Here's your first question from our online audience. What do you see as some key drivers towards better social, economic, and racial integration in Richmond neighborhoods? We all know the history of Richmond's redlining and the impact that it continues to have today. What do you think are some key drivers?
Well, Monica, you kind of already talked about it, which is
Yeah.
so great. So I'm going to pull this out.
Okay.
A lot of folks are like, I don't want rental housing in my neighborhood. And I think that's a big issue, is this kind of belief that we can just keep our single family detached homes, and that's going to be totally equitable. And it's not. When you look at our neighborhoods and you look at where we have zoning that allows for multifamily housing that would allow for affordability, it looks a lot like our eviction map. It looks like a lot like our redlining map. And so we have to really think about zoning as an important tool to allowing for affordable housing development. So say, one of our nonprofit developers wants to build affordable housing. Well, if anyone's followed it or has been to the public meetings, or God bless, had to present at the public meetings, you know that you have to then get a variance. You have to go through all of these bureaucratic steps to convince the neighbors that this is okay. And I think that's something that we really have to work on in the city of Richmond, is really opening up these spaces, because let's be honest here, we know what the cost of real estate is. And short of taking all the real estate and divvying it out equally, which is not going to happen, then we have to really think about how do we build affordably, and that's going to be through more density.
Absolutely. Another question, or somewhat posed, said, you talked about coalitions and building things from the ground up. Would you include landlords in that? I know we focus a lot on tenant rights and protections, but what about landlords being a part of the coalition?
And landlords, it's a tough question, right? Because there's a trust issue there for those who've been working at the ground level. Landlords and tenants aren't known to kind of sit in the same room together. Much like bankers and social workers, right? Housing, I've always said, is a space of strange bedfellows, because it is one of those spaces that is both social service related and social organizing related, and also is about finance. And so unfortunately, this means that those strange bedfellows occasionally are going to have a conversation. What it doesn't mean is that they're all going to agree. Because let's be honest, there are different stakes for landlords than there are for tenants, right? One is talking about their literal home, and the other is talking about sort of their, profit margin, their portfolio, the larger sorts of things that are going on in their jobs. And that's, I don't want to dismiss the landlords who are really trying to do good in the world. But to be honest, it's really hard. But that's not to say that there aren't spaces of agreement. I think that affordable housing funding is one of those spaces that oddly enough gets a whole lot of folks together. You get a lot of folks in the room who are like, yeah, we do need more supply. We do need, there's the folks who are actually trying to do good are like, yeah, I would like to, but I would like to have some subsidy too. So it does allow you to come together, but there are spaces that there's just not going to be agreement because the stakes are different, the goals are different. So, you're gonna, like I said, you agree where you can, you all come together when you can, but understand that there's going to be other spaces where groups are going to have to be off.
Yeah. Are there any questions from our participants here in the exhibit here? Any questions from our participants there? Okay. All righty. Let's see. Yes, we do. Yes, absolutely.
Yep. This is the issue of that unstable tenure, right? So I think this is an excellent point, that I'm glad that you brought it up because we are having, as we said.
Would you restate the question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yes, restate the question. So actually, I'll let you continue your question because I didn't actually let you finish.
It was more just kind of like a thought to
Yep.
throw out there and kind of discuss, just because landlords are accepting the rent
Yep.
from the federal program.
Exactly.
They're
Correct.
I mean, there's discriminating for people who need that help. So
Right.
I'm just wondering what, I'm sure you all thought about it, but I'm wondering what, I guess, in developing the state voucher, what that would look like, or just any.
Sure. Sure, and I think that this gets back to this question about predictable tenure. And so there's a lot of places that have what's called a just cause eviction law, which means that if you have paid your rent and you haven't violated your lease, then your lease is automatically renewed. So our closest jurisdiction to having one of those is DC, but there are jurisdictions across the country that have just cause eviction laws. And this does allow for predictable tenure. Actually, interestingly enough, we do have a system of that in our low-income housing tax credit buildings. It is law that you are supposed to have just cause in order to evict somebody or not renew their lease. And that's something that folks don't often know about and don't often do. But this is really important because, again, people are paying the rent. You're doing it all right. You're getting the state money. The state money is going to the right place. And then your lease is up and landlords are like, see ya. Which was definitely an issue during the moratorium as well, because we were there long enough that you could just not renew a lease.
Okay. We have time for one more. You all can do a dance, or who would like to go? Because I have two questions. Okay.
Regarding vouchers. So one of the things that I do for my job is also kind of call landlords and see what their screening criteria is for our callers. And I found that for vouchers, those landlords will say, well, they need 2 times the rent, with not including the voucher.
Right.
So are there any laws in place, or is there anything in the works to address that screening criteria?
I'm actually going to bounce that to Monica because this is something Home has been really, really, engaged in.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, part of the requirement for, source of income is someone is supposed to be able to accept a voucher. And most cases, it should not be no more than 2 times the monthly rent. I've heard of individuals going beyond that, but that should be the max there. If you're hearing of any other issues, don't hesitate to reach out to us and give us a call.
Yeah, because that's not supposed to be how it
That
goes.
is not how it's supposed to be
So
happening.
that's a fair housing issue that
Yes.
Home gets to do as part of their enforcement work.
So, okay. Well, listen, Dr. Kate, this has been enriching and enlightening and informative. Thank you so much for your time today and being here with us. Thank you for serving on our board as well. Can you join me in giving Dr. Kate Howell a round of applause? Thank you so much. I was telling our team, I said, if we do these again next year, we've got a little bit more time. We always run out of time, but again, thank you so much, Dr. Howell. Next, we are going to have some information from our staff. They want to continue the conversation and really talk about how home has been operating in this space in the present during the current health pandemic, and some things that we continue to hopefully be working on in the near future. I would be remiss if I did not remind you to register for our Fair Housing Summit. I told it to staff, we're going to push this today, and our gala. Don't forget to visit our website at homeofvirginia.org/50. Okay, I should get brownie points today from the staff because I have not forgotten about that. But I want to welcome right now Michelle Jones, who is our Director of Housing Stability. We started this new department a little over 3.5 years ago in partnership with the City of Richmond for our eviction diversion program. And when I hired Michelle, I don't think she could imagine my vision for this department. We started with one program, and now how many programs do we have, Michelle? About 4 or 5, and she's still here. She's still smiling. So definitely, I appreciate all the hard work and her leadership and our team who's in the trenches each and every day trying to help people divert and prevent an eviction. So I'll turn it over to you, Michelle.
Well, thank you, Monica. You know, I was like, Dr. Howell, you can just stay on up here. Make this hard for me. So you're going to make my presentation a lot quicker because a lot of things that we're going to be talking about, you've already talked about. And I can thank you also for the research and the partnership from the RVA Eviction Lab. It has been a tremendous support in the work that we do in being able to have the data. And like you said, we're not short of ideas, but those ideas would not have been able to be generated if we didn't have that data. And so we are very happy about that, because the one thing that we all appreciate is having shelter. And then with that shelter, having stable shelter. But what does stable shelter look like? And Dr. Howell kind of set up that framework in talking about those things with stable, and then what impacts stability. And because stability, it really covers a huge range of things, because it's anything that could threaten your stability. And so that could be things that range from the social, the economic, the health, from just a range of things. And with that, it includes evictions, which we've talked a lot about, and we're going to talk some more about those things. And with, because housing stability includes so much, but it's so important, this division is new at home. Yeah. But it just fits into the ecosystem of what home does. Because there was a housing crisis before the pandemic, there's one today, and we know it's going to continue. So what we are going to face, it's going to require a lot of us coming together and figuring out and elevating the voices in order to address this. One of the things that we're going to talk about today, we're going to look at kind of where we started with the evictions, actions, because Dr. Howell talked about that. I was talking to one of our participants that's here today, and she said, listen, there's just tons of ideas. People are always talking, but I'm not seeing any actions. What actions are happening? Mm-hmm. So I was like, yeah, let's talk about actions today. So next, one of the things, as we highlight about understanding with the instability, that you gotta understand the eviction crisis and addressing that effectively. And as was mentioned about the eviction crisis in Virginia in 2016, the Princeton sociologist Matthew Desmond, he published a book called Evicted. And along with that, he started the Princeton Eviction Lab. The Eviction Lab revealed just an alarming picture of evictions in Virginia. And as you see here, 5 of the top 10 evicting large cities, they were located in Virginia. And we sit in the number 2 one with Richmond. And then with that, we have 3 mid-sized cities that also were in the top 5 of that list. So we know that housing insecurity was a widespread problem. And as was mentioned, where did we see with the profile? We saw it in Virginia, as was indicated with the national data. Next, that it was experienced, disproportionately based on race and ethnicity. And with looking with households that included African-American women, single head of household with children. And with the evictions, we know all the other things that come along with that. When you lose your home, you have to leave your communities. Kids are having to switch schools. It comes with a court record many times, and it's stressful. It's costly, not only to the tenant, it's costly to the landlord also. It affects people's mental health, and the damage on your credit and your rental history, it then even makes it even harder to find housing again. So this begins to follow the household, to follow the individual, to impact long-term with what will happen for being able to access housing. So what are some of the actions that Home has been involved with? We've been part of responding to the eviction instability in several different ways. And when this division was created in 2019, it was in response to the collaboration of a call for action from the city of Richmond. They took a bold move in wanting to address the, to reduce evictions based on the data that had been presented, and they looked at it from how to do they do that and using their local resources. And so the Voluntary Eviction Diversion Pilot Program, it was launched, and Home became a partner and a coordinator of that program through this private partnership, private-public partnership that also includes Central Virginia Legal Aid Society, Greater Richmond Bar Foundation, the Richmond General Courts, and others. I'm going to talk more about this partnership a little bit more on the next slide, but I also, this is what kind of jump-started for the division and for Home to be able to continue to layer what was already happening from their activities and the mission for equitable access. And Dr. Howell talked about being a part of voices. So we were able to bring more voices to the table to be able to leverage, because all of these partners, we were doing stuff here, but the data had shown there was a call to action. Partners came together. There were ideas, but it needed to be addressed. And then through this, we've learned a lot in the 2 years. We've learned a lot from being able to make sure that we're involving individuals that have lived experience, to involve other coalitions, so that we have a diverse voices that are at the table, that are being able to give guidance and input on policies, that are able to give input on the framework and the components of what the program would look like. And the program started in October of 2019, been in, going for about 5 months, and then the pandemic hit. And so, but that framework that we had, it allowed us to be able to continue to pivot and look at how do we address what we had even gotten to a more elevated emergency crisis then. Because as Monica said, this wasn't new to Home. This wasn't new to most people that work in this arena. We were accustomed to a housing crisis, but now we were in one that was integrated with a pandemic that nobody in this room had seen, and very, very few people had seen. So we were, and it was, so now what do we do in this emergency crisis? Home was fortunate enough to be able, through our partnership, to be able to pivot with the eviction diversion program, because that program really did focus on people that were in court, because it was, but we were able to pivot and look at using the resources to address the instability that were being, the households were experiencing at the time, and being able to address those. And then as Virginia responded to the high levels of housing insecurity due to the pandemic relief, the rent relief program was established, and Home became an intermediary and partnered with 13 other subgrantees throughout the state of Virginia. And we were able to be a part of the Rent Relief Program's outreach and engagement initiative. And through that, the focus is on ensuring that individuals in historically disadvantaged communities have access to the resources. And through our efforts since June of 2020, we've been able to serve over 6,000 families with being able to provide a rent of close to $17 million in assistance. The program continues, and we are looking forward to, we have information on our website for how to access that resource. And as Dr. Howell had indicated, we are using what we're doing as we look at, well, what has rent assistance, what has it been able to achieve? We're working in a short-term emergency focus, but then what would that mean from a long term? And so being able to have some input with that. On the long term, the VERT program also, which was a response from the Commonwealth based on the first slide and talking about the eviction crisis in Virginia. This program had already been established before the pandemic, but just like everything else, let's pivot, figure out. But because of Home already having a framework and a foundation based on the work that we had been able to put into a formalized type of component, we were able to access funding for the Virginia Eviction Reduction Program, rental program. And so we became recipients last year, and that allowed us to be able to work and expand what we do in the city of Richmond. So we're expanding it in the metro area, and that allows us to look at prevention before you get to court. What should be strategies? Look at it from a holistic standpoint. Next, please. Time is moving on, and I've got to move on as we get to the countdown. I've told you about the program. I can't go into it all in detail, but we'll talk, continue on. I want to tell you about the framework as we talk about the actions right there. The framework of what we do is a holistic, go back just a little bit. It's a holistic approach. We have in those components outreach to landlords and tenants to inform them about the resources, what's available. We provide educational programs with tenants' rights and responsibilities and landlords' rights and responsibilities. Our rental housing and financial counseling, it's conducted by certified HUD counselors. And that's where we really get a chance to work one-on-one with individuals, help them establish action plans. We do case management. There's the rent payment negotiation, financial assistance, and there's a court navigator program that provides that legal assistance when you're at court. It's a holistic approach. Where do we go from here? You've already talked about it. We know a lot that we are in a hot housing market with rent. It has increased, at a rise of 11% throughout the region within the past 2 years. And we know that the housing crisis of what we're going to face, many of the resources, they're ending. The protections that were in place, they're going to end. And then what's next? And what's next is, how do you become a part of this? How does your voice, how do we help elevate voices so that we are all part of not just creating strategies and solutions, but being out there in action and figuring out what that looks like and has a collective impact. what does that mean? So I'll leave the charge to you. How do you join the movement? And what does that mean from today's conversation?
Thank you so much. Can you join me in thanking Michelle